The Riviera Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy smelled like expensive cigars and cheap disrespect. Thursday night, September 27, 1951, 10:47 p.m. Bumpy Johnson walked through that door wearing a navy blue suit that cost more than most men made in a month and Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He was 46 years old, the undisputed king of Harlem, and he'd been invited to this meeting by Frank Costello himself. The most powerful man in the American Mafia wanted to discuss business, territory, money, the usual negotiations between two empires that shared Manhattan but lived in different worlds. What Bumpy didn't expect was Vincent Calabrese. What nobody expected was what would happen in the next 60 seconds. Vinny Spit, they called him. Not because he was good at talking, but because he had a habit of spitting on the ground when he saw something he didn't like. And on that September night, what Vinny didn't like was a black man walking into an Italian social club like he owned the place. Bumpy had dealt with men like Vinny before, young, stupid, full of themselves because they'd made their first kill and thought that made them untouchable. The Italian mob was full of them.
Kids who grew up in Brooklyn or the Bronx, whose fathers told them stories about the old country, who believed being Italian and being white gave them the right to look down on everyone else.
But Vinny Spit wasn't just disrespectful. He was suicidal. He just didn't know it yet. Bumpy walked past the bar where 6 men sat drinking espresso and grappa, past the card table where 3 capos were playing poker with money that would feed a Harlem family for a year, heading toward the back room where Frank Costello was waiting. That's when Vinny stood up from his bar stool. He was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, wore a gray suit that didn't fit quite right, had slicked back black hair, and a face that looked like it had been in too many fights. He'd been with the Genovese family for 3 years, had made his bones by killing a union organizer in New Jersey, and thought that made him somebody important. Vinny stepped directly into Bumpy's path, not aggressive, not yet, just blocking the way, making Bumpy stop, making everyone in the club notice. "You lost, boy?" Vinny said loud enough for everyone to hear. The entire club went quiet. The espresso machine stopped hissing. The poker game paused mid-hand. Even the jukebox seemed to get quieter, because everyone in that room knew who Bumpy Johnson was, and everyone knew that calling him boy was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Bumpy looked at Vinny, not up at him, they were about the same height, just looked at him with those cold, calculating eyes that had seen men die and never blinked. "I'm here to see Frank Costello," Bumpy said quietly. His voice was calm, measured, showing no emotion. "I was invited." "I don't care if the Pope invited you," Vinny said, his voice getting louder, feeding off the attention. "This is an Italian club. We don't serve coloreds here. We don't do business with coloreds. You people got Harlem. Stay there." The room was absolutely silent now. Every single man in that club was watching, waiting to see how this would play out. Because this wasn't just about one drunk soldier insulting a black gangster. This was about respect. This was about the rules that kept New York's underworld from exploding into all-out war. Rules that said when a boss invites someone to a meeting, you don't disrespect them. You don't insult them. You certainly don't block their path and call them boy. But Vinny Spit either didn't know the rules or didn't care. He looked at Bumpy's shoes, those Italian leather shoes that Bumpy had bought from a shop in Midtown, that he'd had custom made, that he took better care of than most men took care of their children. And Vinny smiled, a mean, ugly smile. Then he spit, not on the ground, not at Bumpy's feet, directly onto Bumpy's right shoe. The glob of saliva landed on the polished leather, thick and white and deliberate, an insult so profound, so disrespectful, that several men in the club gasped. One of the capos at the poker table stood up halfway, his hand moving towards his jacket, not sure what was about to happen, but knowing it was going to be bad. Bumpy looked down at his shoe, looked at the spit slowly sliding down the leather, looked back up at Vinny, who was still smiling, still thinking he'd just proven something about who had power in this room. And Bumpy did something that nobody expected. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even an angry smile. The kind of smile a man gives you when he's already decided how you're going to die, and you don't know it yet. Then Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket. Every man in that club tensed. Hands moved towards guns. The bartender dropped behind the bar. Because when a black man reaches into his jacket in a room full of Italian mobsters, people assume the worst.
But Bumpy didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a white handkerchief. Silk, expensive, monogrammed with his initials. He bent down slowly, deliberately, and wiped the spit off his shoe. Not quickly, not with anger, just methodically cleaning the leather until it shone again. He took his time, 15 seconds, 20. The entire room watching this man kneel in front of his insulter and clean his own shoe like a servant. Vinny started laughing, a loud, braying laugh. "You see that?" he called out to the room. "The big bad Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's king, on his knees cleaning his shoe like a shine boy. That's where you people belong, on your knees."
Several men laughed with him. Not everyone. Some of the older, made men looked uncomfortable, like they understood something Vinny didn't. But the younger ones, the soldiers who'd never fought anyone more dangerous than Union thugs and bookies, they laughed, because they thought this was funny. They thought Bumpy was weak. Bumpy stood up slowly, folded his handkerchief carefully, put it back in his pocket. Then he looked at Vinny. His face was calm, too calm. "What's your name?" Bumpy asked quietly. Vinny was still grinning. "Vincent Calabrese, and you're going to remember it because I'm the guy who made Bumpy Johnson clean his own shoes."
"Vincent Calabrese," Bumpy repeated slowly, like he was memorizing it. "From the Genovese family?" "That's right." Vinny spit. "Ask anybody in Brooklyn about me. Ask them what I do to people who disrespect us." Bumpy nodded once. Then he looked around the room, making eye contact with every single man there. The capos, the soldiers, the bartender, the card dealers. "You all saw what just happened here," Bumpy said, his voice still quiet but carrying through the silent room. "You all saw this man spit on my shoe. You all saw me clean it. And you all saw me walk away without touching him."
He paused. "Let that sink in. Remember that," Bumpy continued. "Remember that I gave him a chance. Remember that I showed restraint. Because in about an hour, every single one of you is going to wish I hadn't." Then Bumpy Johnson turned and walked out of the Riviera Social Club. He didn't look back, didn't say another word, just walked through that door into the September night, leaving Vinny Spit and his audience behind, leaving them laughing and congratulating Vinny on putting the uppity-colored gangster in his place. They thought they'd won. They thought Bumpy had backed down. They were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives.
Bumpy walked 3 blocks before he stopped. He was on Mott Street, in an alley between a bakery and a butcher shop, standing in the shadows where no one could see him. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from rage. Pure, white-hot rage that he'd been controlling since the moment Vinny's spit hit his shoe. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't lose his temper. Men who lost their tempers made mistakes. Men who made mistakes ended up dead or in prison. And Bumpy had spent 25 years perfecting the art of staying alive in a world that wanted him dead.
He took 3 deep breaths, counted to 10, let the rage settle into something colder, something more useful. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black notebook. This notebook contained something more valuable than money, more powerful than guns. It contained information. Names, addresses, relationships, secrets. Everything Bumpy had learned about New York's underworld over 2.5 decades of watching, listening, and remembering. Bumpy flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. Vincent Calabrese. There wasn't much. The kid was relatively new, hadn't made enough of a name for himself to warrant serious intelligence gathering. But there was enough.
Born 1919, Brooklyn. Father, Giuseppe Calabrese, died 1936, dock worker. Mother, Maria Calabrese, alive, lives in Bensonhurst. Sister, Angela Calabrese, Married, 2 kids, husband works for the post office. Made his bones in 1948, killed a union organizer named Patrick O'Brien in Jersey City. Works for Vito Genovese, under capo Anthony Salerno. Known associates, 4 other young soldiers, all Brooklyn kids, all stupid enough to think they were invincible. But it was the last line in the entry that made Bumpy smile, that cold, dangerous smile. Weakness, gambling. Owes $7,000 to Meyer Lansky's operation, 3 weeks overdue.
Bumpy closed the notebook, put it back in his pocket. $7,000. That was all it took to own a man in 1951. That was the leverage that would turn Vincent Spit Calabrese from a tough-talking mobster into a problem that the 5 families couldn't ignore. Bumpy walked to a payphone on the corner of Canal Street, dropped in a nickel, dialed a number he knew by heart. 3 rings. A voice answered. "Yeah? Illinois, it's me," Bumpy said. Illinois Gordon had been Bumpy's right-hand man for 15 years. Ex-boxer, ex-bootlegger, now the man who handled Bumpy's most delicate operations. "Where are you, boss?"
"Little Italy. I need you to make some calls." "What happened?" "Someone forgot their manners. I need to remind them why that's expensive." Illinois knew better than to ask questions when Bumpy used that tone. "What do you need?" Bumpy spoke quickly, precisely, giving instructions that Illinois wrote down word for word. When he finished, Illinois was quiet for a moment. "Boss, you're sure about this? This is going to make waves." "I'm counting on it," Bumpy said. "I want Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and every other family boss to understand something tonight. You don't disrespect Bumpy Johnson. Not in public, not in private, not ever."
"How much time do I have?" 1 hour, Bumpy said. "I told them they had an hour to think about what they'd done. I intend to keep that promise." 1 hour, Illinois repeated. "That's not much time. It's all they're getting. Make the calls. Start with Meyer Lansky. He's going to be very interested to hear that Vincent Calabrese won't be paying his debt. Ever." Bumpy hung up the phone, checked his watch. 10:58 p.m. In exactly 49 minutes, Vincent Calabrese's life was going to change forever, and with it, the power structure of the entire New York underworld.
Back at the Riviera Social Club, Vinny was riding high. He'd just humiliated Bumpy Johnson in front of a dozen made men. He'd proven that the Genovese family didn't bow to black gangsters, no matter how powerful they were in Harlem. He was getting slaps on the back, drink spot for him, respect from men who'd been in the life longer than he'd been alive. "You got balls, kid," one of the older capos said. "I'll give you that. But you better hope Vito heard about this before Bumpy gets back to Harlem." "Let him try something," Vinny said, his 4th drink making him brave. "He comes at me, the whole family comes at him. He's not stupid enough to start a war over getting his shoes cleaned."
But Fat Tony Salerno, Vinny's capo, wasn't smiling. He was sitting in the corner booth, watching Vinny celebrate, and his face had the expression of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. Fat Tony had been in the mob for 30 years. He'd survived Prohibition, survived the Castellamarese War, survived dozens of rivals who'd underestimated their enemies, and he knew something that Vinny didn't. Bumpy Johnson didn't start wars, he ended them. The phone behind the bar rang. Loud, sharp, cutting through the celebration. The bartender answered. His face went pale. "It's for you, Tony," the bartender said quietly. Fat Tony heaved himself out of the booth, walked to the phone. "Yeah?" He listened for 30 seconds. His face got paler with each word. When he hung up, his hand was shaking. "Everybody out," Fat Tony said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority. "Everybody out except Vinny, now." The club emptied in less than 2 minutes. Soldiers, capos, card dealers, all of them filing out into the night, knowing that when Fat Tony used that tone, you didn't ask questions. When the last man left and the door closed, Fat Tony turned to Vinny. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Vinny was confused. The drinks were making it hard to think. "I put that colored boy in his place. I showed him." "You started a war," Fat Tony interrupted.
His voice was ice, and we're going to lose it.
What are you talking about? Vinny's smile was fading now, replaced by confusion and the first hint of fear. Bumpy Johnson's not going to do anything. He walked out with his tail between his legs. Fat Tony grabbed Vinny by the collar, slammed him against the bar. For a man who weighed 300 pounds and moved like a glacier, the speed was shocking. You stupid, stupid kid. Do you know why Frank Costello invited Bumpy Johnson here tonight? Vinny shook his head. To negotiate, to work out territories, to make sure Harlem and Little Italy don't go to war over the policy rackets. We've been trying to set up this meeting for 6 months. 6 months of delicate diplomacy, of messages back and forth, of proving to Bumpy that we respect him enough to sit down and talk like equals.
Fat Tony's grip tightened. And you dumb piece of shit, you spit on his shoe. You disrespected him in front of a dozen witnesses. You made it impossible for him to negotiate without looking weak. You didn't put him in his place. You backed him into a corner. And cornered animals are the most dangerous kind. So what? Vinny tried to sound brave, but his voice cracked. He's one man. We're the Genovese family. We got 500 soldiers. What's he going to do?
That's what I just found out, Fat Tony said. He released Vinny, stepped back, looked at him like he was looking at a corpse. That was Meyer Lansky on the phone. You know who Meyer Lansky is, right? Yeah, the Jew accountant. The guy who handles money for all the families. The guy who handles money for everyone, Fat Tony corrected, including you. Apparently you owe him $7,000, 3 weeks overdue. Vinny's face went white. That's my business. I'm working on it.
You were working on it, Fat Tony said. 5 minutes ago, Bumpy Johnson paid your debt, all $7,000, cash, paid it in full. Vinny didn't understand. Why would he do that? Because now Meyer owns that debt, and Meyer just sold it to Bumpy. Your $7,000 gambling debt is now owed to Bumpy Johnson, with interest, which means Bumpy now owns you. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Vinny's brain was trying to process what that meant, trying to understand how getting your debt paid could be a bad thing.
You still don't get it, Fat Tony said quietly. Let me explain it in simple terms. Bumpy Johnson just bought leverage over you. He can call in that debt anytime he wants. And when he does, if you can't pay, which you can't because you don't have $7,000 plus interest, then you owe him. And a man who owes Bumpy Johnson has 2 choices: work for him or die. The family will protect me, Vinny said desperately. Vito won't let some colored gangster.
Vito doesn't know you exist, Fat Tony interrupted. You're a soldier, a nobody. You think the boss of the Genovese family is going to start a war with Harlem over one stupid kid who couldn't keep his mouth shut? He grabbed Vinny's face, forced him to make eye contact. But it gets worse. That wasn't the only call. While we've been talking, Bumpy's been busy. Real busy. Fat Tony pulled out a piece of paper, unfolded it. His hand was shaking. Your mother, Maria Calabrese, lives at 2847 Bay Parkway, Bensonhurst, ground floor apartment. She's 63 years old, has diabetes, gets her insulin from Palumbo's pharmacy on 86th Street every Tuesday.
Vinny felt his stomach drop. You're bluffing. Your sister Angela lives in Canarsie with her husband Sal and their 2 kids, Anthony, age 7, and Rosa, age 5. The kids go to St. Jude's Elementary School. They walk to school every morning at 8:15, always the same route, down Avenue L, left on East 102nd, right on Avenue M. Fat Tony's voice was getting quieter with each word, which made it more terrifying. Your Uncle Gino runs a bakery on Mott Street. Your cousin Polly works at the Navy Yard. Your girlfriend, the one you think nobody knows about, Mary Sullivan, Irish girl from Hell's Kitchen, works at the Woolworths on 14th Street.
Stop, Vinny whispered. Bumpy Johnson knows where every single person you care about lives, works, sleeps, eats. He's had people watching them for months, because that's what Bumpy does. He collects information. And tonight, in the past 45 minutes,
He's made it very clear that if anything happens to him, if he stubs his toe, if he catches a cold, if a bird shits on his car, your entire family disappears. Not just you, everyone. Fat Tony folded the paper, put it back in his pocket. He's not going to kill you, Vinny. That would be too easy. He's going to make you live with what you did.
He's going to make you wake up every morning knowing that your mother, your sister, your niece and nephew, everyone you love, they're alive because Bumpy Johnson allows them to be alive.
The door to the back room opened. Frank Costello walked out. He was 60 years old, wore a gray suit that cost more than a car, had silver hair combed straight back, and the kind of face that never showed emotion. Behind him came Carlo Gambino, the quiet boss who rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. And behind Carlo came a man Vinny had only seen in photographs, Vito Genovese himself, the boss of Vinny's family, the man who was supposed to protect him. Vito looked at Vinny like he was looking at a cockroach. "Is this the kid?" Vito asked Fat Tony.
Yes, boss. The one who spit on Bumpy Johnson's shoe. Yes, boss. Vito walked over to Vinny slowly. He was shorter than Vinny expected, maybe 5'8", but he carried himself like a giant. He stopped 3 feet away, studying Vinny's face. "What's your name?" "Vincent Calabrese, Mr. Genovese." "Vincent Calabrese," Vito repeated. "You've been with us for 3 years. You made your bones in Jersey. Anthony speaks highly of you, says you're fearless, says you're loyal, says you got a future." Vinny felt hope rising. Maybe this wasn't as bad as Fat Tony said. Maybe the boss was going to protect him after all.
"But he also tells me," Vito continued, his voice dropping, "that you're stupid, that you don't think, that you act on impulse, and tonight you proved him right." Vito stepped closer, close enough that Vinny could smell his cologne. "Do you know what you've done? Do you understand what you've tossed us? He disrespected us by coming here. I thought—" "You didn't think," Vito snapped. "That's the problem. We invited him here. Frank Costello invited him. And when a boss extends an invitation, that man is under protection, our protection. You spit on his shoe. You spit on our honor."
Frank Costello stepped forward now. His voice was calm, educated, the voice of a man who'd negotiated with presidents and senators. "Vinny, I'm going to explain something to you, something that might save your life if you're smart enough to understand it. Bumpy Johnson and I have been trying to avoid a war for 3 years. Harlem and Little Italy have been circling each other like wolves, fighting over territory, over policy banks, over numbers rackets. Every month, someone from his side shoots someone from our side. Someone from our side beats someone from his side. It's expensive, it's messy, and it's bad for business."
"So 6 months ago," Frank continued, "I reached out to Bumpy, privately. I said, let's talk. Let's find a way to divide Manhattan so we're both making money and nobody's dying. It took 6 months to arrange this meeting, 6 months of building trust, of proving we were serious, and you destroyed it in 60 seconds. Vinny wanted to defend himself, but couldn't find words. Carlo Gambino spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. The problem, Vincent, is not that you insulted Bumpy Johnson. The problem is that you did it publicly. Now he can't negotiate with us without looking weak to his people.
If he sits down with Frank tomorrow and makes a deal, everyone in Harlem will say Bumpy let the Italians disrespect him and did nothing. His own people will lose faith in him."
"So he has to respond," Carlo continued. "He has to make an example, not just of you, but of all of us. He has to prove that disrespecting him costs more than we're willing to pay. That's what you forced him to do." Vito turned to Fat Tony. "What's he asking for?" "He hasn't asked for anything yet, boss. He's waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For us to come to him." The room was silent. Every man there understood what that meant. Bumpy Johnson wasn't going to make demands. He wasn't going to threaten. He was going to sit in Harlem and wait for the 5 families to come crawling to him, asking what it would take to make this go away.
Frank Costello checked his watch. "It's 11:48. He said an hour. That means we have exactly 1 minute before whatever he's planned goes into motion.
"We need to move fast," Carlo said. "We need to offer him something he can't refuse, something that satisfies his honor and ours." Vito looked at Vinny one more time. "You're done in New York. You understand that, right? After tonight, you can't work for us here. Your face is poison. Every time Bumpy sees you, he's reminded of the disrespect. Every time we see you, we're reminded of the disaster you caused."
"Where do I go?" Vinny asked quietly. "I don't care," Vito said. "California, Florida, Canada, anywhere but here. Fat Tony will give you $5,000. That's more than you deserve, but we take care of our own. You leave tonight. You don't come back. You don't call. You don't write. You disappear. And maybe, if you're lucky and Bumpy's feeling merciful, your family gets to live normal lives without looking over their shoulders." "And if I don't leave?" Vinny asked. The question was stupid, but he had to ask.
Vito smiled, no warmth in it. "Then Bumpy Johnson collects his debt. And trust me, kid, you don't want to see how he collects." The clock on the wall ticked to 11:49 p.m., exactly 1 hour since Vinny spit on Bumpy's shoe. The phone rang. Everyone in the room jumped. Fat Tony answered. "Yeah?" He listened for 5 seconds. His face went from pale to gray. "It's for you, Mr. Costello. It's Bumpy Jurison." Frank took the phone. "Mr. Johnson, I apologize for—" He stopped talking, listened. His expression didn't change, but his knuckles went white, gripping the receiver. After 2 minutes, Frank said, "I understand. We'll be there in 30 minutes.
He hung up, looked at Vito, then at Carlo. "He wants to meet, now. The Copacabana. He's already there, waiting." "What does he want?" Vito asked. Frank's voice was tight. "He didn't say, but he did say something interesting. He said, 'I want all 5 families represented. Not soldiers, not capos, bosses only, because what I'm about to propose is going to change how New York works. And I want the men who make decisions to hear it directly from me.'" Carlo raised an eyebrow. "That's bold." "That's Bumpy Johnson," Frank said. He turned to Vinny. "You're not coming. You've done enough damage for 1 lifetime. Fat Tony, get him out of the city. Tonight."
"What about my family?" Vinny asked desperately. "Will they be safe?" Frank looked at him with something that might have been pity. "That depends on what happens in the next hour. If Bumpy's satisfied with what we offer, maybe. If he's not," Frank let the sentence hang, "pray that we're good negotiators." The bosses left the Riviera Social Club at 11:52 p.m. 3 cars, heavily armed drivers, heading south toward Midtown Manhattan, toward the Copacabana, the most famous nightclub in New York, where Bumpy Johnson was sitting at a corner table, sipping bourbon, waiting for the 5 families to come bow to him.
Back in the club, Vinny sat alone at the bar. Fat Tony was in the back office, counting out $5,000 in cash. The money that was supposed to buy Vinny a new life somewhere far away from New York, far away from Bumpy Johnson's reach. But Vinny wasn't thinking about California or Florida. He was thinking about 60 seconds. 60 seconds from the moment he spit on Bumpy's shoe to the moment Bumpy walked out that door. 60 seconds that had somehow destroyed his entire life, his career in the mob, his future, his family's safety. 60 seconds that had brought the 5 most powerful crime bosses in America to their knees, forced them to drive across Manhattan in the middle of the night to negotiate with a man they'd assumed was beneath them.
Vinny reached for his drink. His hand was shaking. He drained the glass, signaled for another. The bartender poured without speaking, without making eye contact, because everyone in Little Italy would know by morning what Vinny had done, and nobody wanted to be associated with the man who'd humiliated the Genovese. Somewhere in Manhattan, 5 crime bosses were about to learn what Vincent Calabrese was learning right now. That disrespecting Bumpy Johnson didn't cost you your life. It cost you something far more valuable. Your pride, your power. Your belief that being white and being connected made you untouchable. Because Bumpy Johnson had just proven something that would echo through New York's underworld for the next 20 years.
He'd proven that a black man from Harlem, armed with nothing but intelligence and patience and the ability to turn an insult into leverage, could make the Italian Mafia beg for mercy. And he'd done it all in 60 seconds. 60 seconds that changed everything.
The Copacabana nightclub on East 60th Street was the kind of place where movie stars drank with mobsters and nobody asked questions. Thursday night, just past midnight, the main room was packed with 400 people dancing to a live orchestra, but the VIP room in the back was empty except for one man. Bumpy Johnson sat at a circular table, his back to the wall, a glass of bourbon in front of him, untouched. He'd changed his shoes. The ones Vinny had spit on were in a trash can 3 blocks away. Not because they were ruined, Bumpy had cleaned them perfectly, but because he never wanted to wear them again. He wanted to remember this night.
Wanted to remember the feeling of being disrespected in a room full of men who thought they were better than him because of the color of their skin. Wanted to remember why what he was about to do was necessary.
The door opened. Frank Costello walked in first, followed by Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and Joe Bonanno. The 5 families, the commission. The 5 men who controlled organized crime in America. They looked at Bumpy sitting there, calm as Sunday morning, and every single one of them felt something they hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. Because they'd been summoned. They'd been called to this meeting by a black gangster who turned a personal insult into a crisis that threatened to explode into war. And they'd come, all of them, which meant Bumpy had already won something.
Frank gestured to the empty chairs. "May we sit?" "It's your club," Bumpy said quietly. "I'm just a guest." The 5 men sat. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The tension in that room could have been cut with a knife. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "Mr. Johnson, I want to apologize for what happened tonight. Vincent Calabresi acted without authorization, without respect, without understanding the consequences of his actions. He's been removed from New York. He'll never bother you again." Bumpy took a sip of his bourbon. "Where'd you send him?"
"Does it matter?" Vito asked. His voice had an edge. "It matters to me," Bumpy said, looking directly at Vito. "Because I want to make sure he's far enough away that I never have to see his face again. Because if I see him, Mr. Genovese, I'm going to kill him, and then we're going to have a problem." "California," Frank said quickly. "We sent him to California, with money. He understands he can never come back." Bumpy nodded. "Good, because that boy didn't just disrespect me, he disrespected every black person in New York. Every man and woman who's been spit on, literally or figuratively, by people who think being white makes them superior. Every person who's had to swallow their pride and keep walking because fighting back meant dying."
"I understand," Frank said, "and we want to make this right. What do you want? Money? Territory? We're prepared to be generous." "I don't want your money," Bumpy said. His voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath. "I don't want your territory. What I want is something you can't buy and you can't give. I want respect." Carlo Gambino leaned forward. "You have our respect, Mr. Johnson. We invited you to negotiate as equals. What happened with Calabresi was an aberration." "Was it?" Bumpy asked. He looked around the table, making eye contact with each man. "Because I've been in this business for 25 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've been invited to sit at a table with Italian bosses as an equal."
"Usually, you send emissaries. Usually, you make demands. Usually, you assume that Harlem belongs to you, and we are just tenants who pay rent."
"That's not," Vito started. "Yes, it is," Bumpy interrupted. "Let's not pretend. We all know how this works. You control the docks, the unions, the politicians. We control Harlem. But when there's a dispute, when territories overlap, who gets the final say? You do, because you have more men, more guns, more connections. Because when push comes to shove, the police and the courts and the politicians, they all side with white criminals over black criminals. That's the truth. That's what Vincent Calabresi understood when he spit on my shoe. He understood that in a world where white means power, he could disrespect me and get away with it."
The 5 bosses were silent, because Bumpy was right. They all knew it. The system was designed to favor them. But here's what Vincent didn't understand, Bumpy continued. Power isn't just about guns and connections. Power is about leverage. Power is about knowing your enemy better than they know themselves. Power is about patience and intelligence and the willingness to play a long game. He pulled out his black notebook, set it on the table. This notebook contains 25 years of information. Names, addresses, relationships, weaknesses. Every Italian mobster in New York, from the bosses down to the street soldiers. Who's cheating on their wives, who's skimming money, who's informing to the feds.
Who's got gambling debts, drug habits, secrets they'd kill to keep hidden?
"You're bluffing," Tommy Lucchese said. Bumpy opened the notebook, flipped to a page, read aloud. Thomas Lucchese, 3-finger Brown, born 1899, lost right index finger in factory accident, 1915. Married to Frances, daughter of Antonio Papadio, 2 daughters. Lives at 106th Street and Park Avenue. Drives a 1950 Cadillac. Favorite restaurant is Rao's in East Harlem. Always orders the seafood pasta. Has a mistress in Brooklyn, Angela Martino, 24 years old. Works as a cigarette girl at the 5 Spot. Been seeing her for 18 months. Wife doesn't know. Tommy's face went pale. "How did you—"
"I know everything," Bumpy said simply. He flipped to another page. Carlo Gambino came to America in 1921 as a stowaway. Married to Catherine Castellano, first cousin. 2 sons, Thomas and Joseph. You're planning to take over the Mangano family. Albert Anastasia's getting sloppy, making mistakes. You're gathering support among the capos, preparing for a coup, probably within the next 2 years. Carlo's expression didn't change, but his eyes went cold as ice. Bumpy closed the notebook. "I could go on. I have information on every single one of you, on your families, your operations, your plans. I've been collecting it for years, because knowledge is the only weapon a black man has in a world controlled by white men."
"So what?" Vito said, trying to sound tough. "You gonna blackmail us? You think that'll work?" "No," Bumpy said. "I'm going to offer you a deal. A real partnership. Not the kind where you tell me what to do and I follow orders. The kind where we sit down as equals, divide territory fairly, and protect each other's interests. You want Harlem's policy banks? Fine. We negotiate percentages. You want access to our numbers racket? Fine. We work out terms. But it's negotiation, not dictation." "And if we refuse?" Joe Bonanno asked quietly. "Then I use this information," Bumpy said, tapping the notebook. "I leak it to your rivals. I tell Albert Anastasia that Carlo's planning a coup. I tell your wives about your mistresses.
I tell the feds who's been bribing which politicians. I burn down your operations from the inside, and I do it without firing a single shot."
Frank Costello studied Bumpy for a moment. Then he smiled, a real smile, impressed despite himself. "You know what the beautiful thing is? You can't kill him for this. You kill him, this information goes public. He's got it stashed somewhere, with instructions to release it if he dies. That's why he's so calm. He's made himself untouchable." "Smart," Carlo admitted grudgingly. "Very smart." "So what do you want?" Frank asked. "Specifically, give us terms we can work with." Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "First, Harlem stays black. You can operate there, but only with our permission and our partnership. No unilateral moves, no soldiers acting on their own. Everything gets negotiated."
Second, when there are disputes between your organizations and mine, we settle them through mediation, not violence. We set up a council, 3 of your people, 3 of mine, and we vote on resolutions, majority rules. Third, you start treating black gangsters with the same respect you treat Italian gangsters. No more calling us boys, no more assuming we're inferior, no more spitting on our shoes. We're equals, or this deal doesn't work. The 5 bosses looked at each other, silent communication passing between them. Finally, Frank spoke. "We agree to the first 2 terms. The third term, respect, that's harder to enforce.
But we'll make it clear to our people that anyone who disrespects your organization answers to us.
That's the best we can offer.
Bumpy thought about it. Then he nodded. I'll accept that, with one addition. Vincent Calabresi's debt to me, the $7,000, I'm forgiving it. Consider it a gesture of good faith. But he stays in California, forever. If he comes back to New York, all bets are off. Done, Vito said immediately. He's an idiot anyway. We're better off without him. Frank extended his hand across the table. Do we have a deal, Mr. Johnson? Bumpy looked at that hand, thought about all the times he'd been denied a seat at tables like this, thought about all the black gangsters who'd been killed or marginalized because the Italian mob saw them as competition instead of partners.
Thought about Vincent Calabresi spitting on his shoe and how that single act of disrespect had given him the leverage to change everything.
He shook Frank's hand. We have a deal. One by one, the other bosses shook his hand. Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno. 5 handshakes that represented a fundamental shift in how New York's underworld operated. When the meeting ended and the bosses left, Bumpy sat alone at that table for a few more minutes. He finished his bourbon, savored the burn. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the Copacabana into the early morning darkness. It was 1:23 a.m., less than 3 hours since Vincent Calabresi had spit on his shoe.
Bumpy walked north toward Harlem. He could have taken a cab, but he wanted to walk, wanted to think about what had just happened. He turned an insult into an opportunity. He'd used one stupid kid's racism as leverage to force the 5 families to negotiate as equals. He'd done what every black gangster in New York had been trying to do for 30 years, get a seat at the table where real power was decided. And he'd done it all without firing a single shot. The sun was starting to rise by the time Bumpy reached Harlem. The streets were quiet, just a few early workers heading to their jobs, a few late-night drunks stumbling home. Bumpy walked to Wells' restaurant, his headquarters, his kingdom. Illinois Gordon was waiting inside, along with Willie Fish Jackson and a dozen other men who'd been on standby all night, ready for war if negotiations had failed.
How'd it go, boss? Illinois asked. Bumpy smiled, that rare, genuine smile. We won. What did you get? Everything, Bumpy said. Partnership, respect, a seat at the table. From now on, when the 5 families make decisions about New York, Harlem has a voice. The room erupted in celebration, men shaking hands, slapping backs, understanding that something fundamental had changed tonight, that their boss had walked into a meeting with the 5 most powerful mobsters in America and walked out with a deal that made them equals.
But Bumpy wasn't celebrating. He was thinking about Vincent Calabresi, somewhere in California, starting a new life, probably still not understanding what he'd done wrong. Thinking about how one act of casual racism had backfired so spectacularly that it had changed the power structure of organized crime in New York. Thinking about all the other Vincent Calabresis out there, young and stupid and convinced that being white gave them the right to disrespect anyone who wasn't. Boss, Illinois said quietly, you okay? Yeah, Bumpy said, just thinking. About what? About respect, Bumpy said. About how some people think it's given based on the color of your skin, and how tonight we proved that respect is earned, not given. Earned through intelligence, through patience, through being smarter than your enemies, even when they assume you're not. He looked around at his men. Vincent Calabresi spit on my shoe because he thought I was beneath him. He thought being Italian and being connected made him superior to a black man from Harlem. But in 60 seconds, I showed him and everyone watching that power doesn't come from your last name or your skin color. Power comes from up here. Bumpy tapped his temple. From knowing more than your enemy knows. From being 3 steps ahead when they think they're winning.
From turning their disrespect into your leverage. What happened to Calabresi? Willie asked. California, Bumpy said. with $5,000 and a lifetime ban from New York. He'll spend the rest of his life wondering how he went from humiliating me to losing everything in less than 2 hours.
That's it? Willie seemed disappointed. He doesn't die? Death is mercy, Bumpy said. I want him to live. I want him to wake up every morning knowing that his stupid decision cost him his career, his family's safety, his entire future. I want him to spend decades understanding that the black man he spit on was smarter, stronger, and more powerful than he ever imagined. That's better than death. That's justice. The sun was fully up now, painting Harlem's streets in gold. Bumpy walked to the window, looked out at his neighborhood, his kingdom, the place he'd protected for 25 years.
The place that would now be protected by an agreement with the 5 families, an agreement negotiated as equals, an agreement that would last until the day he died.
You know what the beautiful thing is? Bumpy said to no one in particular. Vincent Calabrese thought he was putting me in my place when he spit on my shoe. He thought he was reminding me that white criminals run New York, and black criminals just exist at their pleasure. He turned back to face his men. But all he did was give me the excuse I needed to force a meeting, to put the 5 families in a position where they had to negotiate, to prove that Harlem doesn't bow to anyone. He did in 60 seconds what I'd been trying to do for 5 years, and he has no idea. Illinois laughed. So we should thank him? No, Bumpy said. We should remember him. Remember that our enemy's arrogance is our greatest weapon.
Remember that when they underestimate us, that's when we're most dangerous.
The celebration continued around him, but Bumpy was already thinking ahead, thinking about the council meetings that would happen, the territory negotiations, the careful balance of power that would have to be maintained, thinking about the younger generation coming up, black kids and Italian kids and Irish kids, all fighting for their piece of New York, wondering if this agreement would last, or if in 10 or 20 years someone else would make the same mistake Vincent Calabrese made. Someone else would forget that respect isn't about race or connections, it's about capability. And when that happened, Bumpy would be ready, because he was always ready, because that's what kings do.
They prepare for the next war while everyone else celebrates the last one.
Somewhere in California, Vincent Spit Calabrese was probably sleeping in a cheap motel, his $5,000 hidden under his mattress, his future uncertain, probably dreaming about the life he'd lost, the career that had been destroyed, the family he'd put at risk, probably still not understanding that the 60 seconds from when he spit on Bumpy Johnson's shoe to when Bumpy walked out that door were the most expensive 60 seconds of his life. But in Harlem, in Wells' restaurant, as the sun climbed higher and the city woke up, Bumpy Johnson stood at the window and smiled, because Vincent Calabrese had taught him something valuable. He taught him that sometimes your enemy does your work for you.
Sometimes the disrespect they show you becomes the leverage you need. Sometimes losing a battle means winning the war. And that's exactly what had happened. The 5 families had bowed. Not because Bumpy had more guns or more money or more soldiers. They'd bowed because he'd been smarter, because he'd turned an insult into an opportunity, because he'd proven that a black man from Harlem could sit at the table with the most powerful criminals in America and walk away with everything he wanted. All because one stupid kid spit on his shoe. "Boss," Illinois said, "the men want to know, what do we do now?" Bumpy turned from the window. "Now we work. Now we build. Now we make sure that every black gangster in New York understands what happened here tonight, understands that respect isn't given, it's earned.
And we just earned ours." He raised his glass. "To respect, and to the idiots who underestimate us."
The room erupted in cheers, and Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, the man who just made the 5 families bow, drank to a future where black gangsters were finally, truly equals. A future that started with 60 seconds and 1 glob of spit on a pair of Italian leather shoes.
a future that Vincent Calabrese had accidentally created by being exactly what Bumpy needed him to be, a catalyst for change wrapped in the package of casual racism. The story would spread through New York's underworld within days. By the end of the week, every gangster from Boston to Miami would know, don't disrespect Bumpy Johnson.
Because if you do, he'll turn your arrogance into his power, your insult into his victory, your 60 seconds of feeling superior into a lifetime of regret. That was the lesson. That was the legend. That was the night Bumpy Johnson proved that respect isn't about the color of your skin. It's about the strength of your mind. And his mind had just changed New York forever.